Greetings, hello, and welcome to United Europe's latest event. Today we have His Excellency Karel van Oosterom, the Netherlands Ambassador to the UK, who is going to talk to us about diplomacy and working with the private sector hand in hand. Karel, if you'd like to take the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much, James, and it's really a pleasure this evening to be with United Europe. As far as I'm aware, it's one of the most prestigious organizations in Germany, especially, but also wider in Europe, to promote, I would say, unity and diversity and competitiveness in Europe. So it's a personal privilege to be with you this evening, and certainly in the Netherlands, we're looking forward to the elections in Germany, and we hope that the special relationship we enjoy with all our German colleagues and friends, and Rotterdam being the biggest port of Germany, someone once said, and the special friendship between our Prime Minister Rutte and Bundeskanzler Merkel will indeed continue with the new Bundeskanzler. James, if it would be possible, I think it would be better if you could get the PowerPoint on all screen. It makes for a better picture.
How's that?
Can you get the PowerPoint on all screen instead of seeing what we see at the moment?
How's that?
Here you are. This is much better. Thank you so much. When I reflected a little bit on what I would like to discuss with you about, and I thought I'm going to have a discussion, as you mentioned, about diplomacy in the private sector, but in view of the ambitions of United Europe, I'm going to connect it to the European Union. I'm going to talk about the nexus between diplomacy, the private sector, and the importance of the European Union as such. And let's go to the next slide, please. I will first start with on the first slide in a minute from my own CV, how I moved myself from the private sector to diplomacy, and how the nexus of diplomacy, the EU and the private sector are enshrined in my character and my career. We'll go to the global level, the United Nations, and what there the private sector, diplomacy and European Union have in common and what it means, certainly for private companies. Then I'll go to the next level, diplomacy in the European Union and by the European Union, certainly in the current international context. And then fourth, I'll go to the issue of bilateral diplomacy. Currently, I'm ambassador in London for the Netherlands, and what we do certainly as a result of Brexit and what it means in relation to the private sector, also in the wider EU context. And then I'll end up with some conclusions about the private sector and diplomats in practice. So that's the structure of my presentation. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just to introduce myself a little bit and why the theme of private sector diplomacy in the European Union is something I'm passionate about. Let me explain a little bit about my own CV. I was a platoon commander in the Grenadier Guards in the beginning of the 80s. And when I left the army, I joined the Netherlands Management Association, NIVE. And the Netherlands Management Association is basically a platform of managers, certainly of the private sector, where I had a management consultancy kind of role in which we worked very closely in making companies work together, making them more effective, more efficient, and increasing the internal management of a lot of private companies. I did it for some time, but my real passion still was for diplomacy. So I joined the Foreign Service in the middle of the 80s, and since then I've been working in many places like Damascus, China, and New York in the past 7 years before coming to London last year. In Damascus, for instance, I worked a lot with Dutch companies on promoting trade, recovering debt. There was an enormous debt problem at the time, and certainly helping Dutch companies compete with German companies in government tenders in Damascus. In Beijing, in between 2002 and 2006, we worked a lot, certainly, but much more on trade and technology transfer both ways, and on promotion of investments, both inwards into China and at certain moments, certainly also from China to the Netherlands. And there was also a keen EU aspect because the relationship between the European Union and China became ever more relevant in the first 10 years of this century. And I remember competing very actively with Deutsche Bank about an investment in the Bank of Beijing, which in the end was won by ING, and Deutsche Bank was really disappointed with the Dutch that we beat them. So we're not only friends, sometimes we're also competitors. In capital, in The Hague, in our ministry, I have also worked a lot, for instance, with companies in the armament sector. When I was head of arms export policies in our ministry, and before going into New York in 2013, I worked for my prime minister, and yet also for our current prime minister Mark Rutte as foreign policy and defense advisor, and I was political director in the ministry. In all these jobs, I mentioned the EU aspect for any diplomat of my age was always at the forefront of what we were doing. Promoting European cooperation, promoting the internal market, or creating a more effective foreign policy together. Let's go to the next slide, please. I mentioned that I went to New York in 2013, and that'll be the first issue of substance I would like to discuss with our friends at United Europe. At the global level, the EU is a very active player, and the private sector is one of the key dimensions of the work we did in the UN. Many of you, and certainly the most major German companies, have been quite active ever since, I think it was 2005, when we started discussing what is the corporate responsibility of private sector when it comes to global issues. In 2005, it was Ruggie who had the request of SG Ban Ki-moon to start working on what is corporate social responsibility. And I remember vividly in 2006 when he presented the Ruggie principles about the corporate due diligence, corporate social responsibility, and certainly respect for human rights. And maybe I might summarize it that was the moment that the concept of do no harm was enshrined in the, I would say, the guidance from the United Nations for the private sector. On the other side, in 2015, 2 years after I arrived in New York, we negotiated for almost 2 years with the other countries involved about the Sustainable Development Goals. We had agreed that we would try to make a connection between the Ruggie principles, the Millennium Development Goals, which we had started in 2000, and I would say the sustainability agenda, the climate agenda. And after 2 years in negotiations, we arrived on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the slides you see here in the center, the nexus between the Ruggie principles and the Sustainable Development Goals. My son, when he graduated 4 years ago, his final thesis was on this transition, and he called it From Doing No Harm, that's the time of the Ruggie principles, to doing the right thing. And that's something I really think also for the private sector in Germany is a key thing. What I know about German companies, but let's have a conversation on that later on. German companies are also incorporating in their company strategy the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and contributing to Agenda 2030, which is in the interest of the companies involved as well. It's not just a moral thing, it's also the economic sensible thing to do. In the thesis of my son, he did research in 5 major Dutch companies, and it turned out that the most profitable Dutch companies are the ones who align their corporate strategy with the Sustainable Development Goals. So from doing no harm to doing the right thing, that nexus between the UN, the global corporate social responsibility, and the private sector is key. And the European Union, of course, when we were negotiating this, the European Union is a force for good in New York, in the United Nations. And together with all the other member states, I really think we made a huge difference. Let's broaden that up a little bit. I mentioned the UN. In the Netherlands, there's the Center for Strategic Studies, which did research on the importance of multilateral organizations for our national economy and certainly for the private sector. And they found that, especially because this in the Netherlands, and it might be in Germany the same, but certainly in some other European countries it is, there are elements in the political spectrum who claim that international cooperation is no good, that a country like the Netherlands should leave the European Union or should leave NATO, and we'd better hide behind the dikes. But that research shows that on average, the income of the Dutch is on average 10,000 euros higher than it would have been without the WTO, without the work of making trade agreements, without the OECD, without all the other organizations, and certainly without the European Union. So working multilaterally, making international agreements, trying to create a level playing field with all the international organizations which are there, work which is being done by humble diplomats like me and all my colleagues, is of crucial interest to the health and wealth of our peoples, and immediately, of course, also for the private sector. The third element, which is very often forgotten at the global level, is we take for granted that we have a stable, secure environment around us. I will give an example. When I worked in Syria in 92, 96, we took it for granted there was a stable environment. It was more or less secure, although it was a police state. And a Dutch company like Royal Dutch Shell had a major investment there and was producing a lot of oil for the world market and was generating a lot of revenue. Revenue for its shareholders, but also revenue for people who profit from the taxes they paid. When in 2011 the crisis broke out in Damascus and in Syria, within 1 year that whole operation, investment of billions and billions of dollars, disappeared, and it meant that that whole market connected to that, both for Shell, but certainly for all the international companies who were working there, including Siemens, including Adidas, boom, it just evaporated. And one of the key things we diplomats do is try to create a stable environment for companies to work in. I mentioned I was going to connect every issue also to the European Union. I mentioned the role of the European Union in the United Nations in trying to create that stable and more just and more healthy environment for the world, for countries, for peoples, and also for the private sector. And also in the slides, you see me in the Security Council, where I was in 2018. In the beginning, you saw my book on the first slide. In the Security Council, by working for peace and security in the world, making sure that conflicts are resolved, that has an enormous impact for the world. Last point, also bottom right, where I'm presiding over a meeting on North Korea, where the private sector will also really encounter the United Nations and the European Union is in the implementation of sanctions. Security Council can impose sanctions on countries which behave extremely, and North Korea, of course, is a case in point. And when we were in the Security Council, we made sure that all the sanctions which were agreed upon in the Council were implemented. And we worked so closely together with our Brussels colleagues to make sure that those countries which are not implementing those sanctions, which has North Koreans working for pitiful salaries in their own economy, in their own companies, that we made sure that there was an end to that kind of contract. Or when there was illegal smuggling of elements of weapons of mass destruction, certainly for the nuclear program and the ballistic program in North Korea, we made sure that that kind of exports were limited. So again, there's a nexus between the private sector, the European Union, and diplomats. So this was the global level, all the global organizations we have, and the interaction between the three core groups I mentioned. We go to the next slide, and that's a little bit lower, which is the European Union. Next slide, please. Of course, ever since '56, the first Rome Treaty and the development of the European communities and development into the European Union, for the younger generation, it's taken for granted that the European Union exists. Let's not forget that we have a checkered history in the past centuries in which wars between the countries of Europe were almost continuous, or certainly regular. And so much loss has taken place in the past because of that lack of peace. So first of all, it's a miracle what we have been able to achieve. And the work of heroes of mine like Schumann and Monet, we know them as foremost thinkers, as political leaders, but their work in making of the treaties and all the treaties we made in the past, including Maastricht, including Lisbon, it's humble diplomats like me who worked on those treaties to make sure that we would create the single market, the internal market. A market which is taken for granted, and in German, I think one would say, we think it's selbstverständlich that that internal market is there, but it's not a given. So to make sure that it functions and that our citizens profit from the agreements we make in the European Union, we set up all the institutions in Brussels. We work very closely with the private sector. And that's certainly why we have been able to continue the peace and security of our peoples in Europe, but certainly also the continent has become so wealthy, prosperous, maybe is the best word. And that the amount of social justice we have been able to construct together with each other, which is really of profit to all our people, is there. Our work in Europe continues, work which has enormous impact to the private sector as well. Single market is easy, it's profitable for all of us. Not always easy, but it makes sure the level playing field in the EU is there. But we have enormous challenges ahead of us. I just wanted to mention two specifically, climate and Brexit. On climate, after we concluded the agreement in Paris and subsequently finished it in New York a couple of years ago, we now have to implement that. And the program which has been proposed under the leadership of a former colleague of mine, Frans Timmermans, with whom I joined the Foreign Service in the middle of the 80s, Fit for 55, the EU Green Deal, will have an enormous impact for all companies in Europe. We're talking about a carbon tax on imports for countries which do not have a carbon tax, so a border adjustment mechanism. We're talking about limits. It's really the energy transition which is ahead of us, in which we're working with the private sector, in which we're working with knowledge institutions, all governments together, under the leadership of the European colleagues in Brussels, is enormous. And it will call for enormous investment as well from the private sector to realize our huge ambitions, to make sure that we can stop climate change. And coming from the Netherlands, and many of you have been to the Netherlands. At a certain moment, I arrived from the United States in a plane. I arrived at Schiphol Airport. I was sitting next to an American tourist, and he looked at the altitude meter in the plane. He said, "My goodness, the altitude meter of the plane is wrong." I said, "Why do you say that?" Because we arrived at Schiphol Airport, and he said, "It says -6, that's impossible." And I explained that Schiphol in Amsterdam, near Amsterdam, is -6 below sea level as a major part of our country is. And that's why we are so vulnerable. And climate change for us is really an existential issue. So Fit for 55, the major agenda for the coming decades. And then on the short term, you see a small picture about Brexit, and certainly it connects to my current job. We took it for granted of an ever-closing European Union, and it's even in the Lisbon Treaty. Brexit, in that sense, was a wake-up call that kind of ambition can only exist if our politicians, if our whole government can connect to the people and can explain the benefits to the people who vote, can explain the benefits about about the benefits of the European Union for us. It's difficult, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute, but it has enormous geopolitical consequences. It has economic ramifications. The disentangling of the web we created together in the past 30 years is complicated. And every discussion we now have with the Brits is about how does it work in practice? How can we make it happen? But it also has geopolitical implications because you will have read about the ambitions on strategic autonomy, on enhancing the geopolitical role of Europe globally. And instead of doing that with 27 countries, we suddenly do that with 26. And for me as a diplomat, and all my life, I've been working in that obvious, and I took for granted that the European Union was there. I took for granted that our three biggest neighbors, Germany, France, and the UK, were aligned in their foreign policies, in their ambitions. We always worked closely with that group, and suddenly one of those three major neighbors, and the Netherlands can only exist because France, Germany, and the UK never could agree on who would get our small part of the globe. The fact that that has gone, is still something we're grappling with the consequences. Maybe let's go to the next slide, please. So what does it mean? What does it mean for our work? Because now I'm now ambassador in London. So I talked about the United Nations, I talked about the level of Brussels, European Union, and now I'm ambassador to the United Kingdom since last year in August. I think Brexit is the key element of the work we do here at the embassy. We have three core groups. We help citizens, we help companies, and we help, I would say, civil service in The Hague. First on citizens, I don't know how many German citizens live in the UK, but it must be 300,000-400,000, I presume, maybe even more. From the Netherlands, we have 150,000 people with a Dutch passport who live in the United Kingdom. That's an enormous amount. It's a medium-sized city in the Netherlands. And because of Brexit, the fact that they could live in the United Kingdom was under threat. They had to apply for, I would say, a permanent visa, maybe. The formal word is they should apply for settled status. But to reach all those people was an enormous effort we undertook in the past couple of years. And we've reached out to tens of thousands of Dutch citizens and helped them in the application process. And we're still discussing with the British government on what it means and how it works in practice, because still that transition is an enormous challenge. Secondly, the private sector. I mentioned a key client of our embassy. The trade with United Kingdom, and many of you in the companies you represent no doubt have encountered it as well. For the Netherlands, even more intense, because we're in between Germany and the UK, and a lot of trade of Germany with the UK goes via Rotterdam port. But access and transition and transshipment to the UK has really increased enormously in problems. Trade between, shall we say, Rotterdam and Manchester was as easy as selling something from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, or from Amsterdam to Bonn or to Berlin. You made a deal, you had one single source document for customs, and boom, you could bring it to your client. Suddenly, now to bring one consignment of cucumbers to the UK, you need 9 documents, and on average, the cost of sending something to the UK is now, only when it comes to customs papers, is around 120, 130 extra euros, which it costs, so maybe even more. Worse, the amount of paperwork is so much that there's not enough staff, certainly not on the British side, to handle it. So it means that trade has really taken a hit both ways. And what we do as an embassy, we're helping Dutch companies. We're helping them in solving problems. Like our embassy has doubled its staff. We have a customs officer now in our embassy. And on a daily basis, he's talking to colleagues either in Dutch ports or in British ports, trying to get containers which are stuck in customs, get them released. And there's very practical problems. Maybe I have an example. For us, England was very used as the bridge between the Netherlands and Ireland. So when something comes from Rotterdam port, it goes to British port, then a truck will drive the container to the other side of England, and it will go on a ship towards Ireland. And it was very cost effective. So one of the Dutch major tomato plant producers had an order of a couple of million euros in a couple of containers by truck. When leaving a Rotterdam port, it said we leave, they filled in the wrong papers in essence, because they didn't understand how it worked yet. And then when it ended up, so it came into the UK, and when it ended up in Holyrood, the port for access to Ireland, unfortunately, re-export called for enormous different set of documents which should already have been filled in Rotterdam. So our customs officer worked for 2 days, and I think he had 3 days before all the plants were dead. And one of the nicest emails I ever got from a private company was a tomato plant grower who almost had lost a couple of million in business because of the new red tape, which he had not quite understood. So we're helping companies, we're helping citizens, and then of course we're helping reconnect the two governments. And I know my German colleague is doing exactly the same thing, and basically all my European colleagues here in London are doing the same thing. In the old days, and James, I know you're in Brussels, in the old days in Brussels, the top echelon of civil servants of all European countries were talking to their counterparts with the UK. If there was an issue on transshipment, on crime, on legal cooperation, on education, there's all these working groups, the committees in Brussels, and you could have either a small one-on-one amarge of a meeting, or you would say, let's talk before or after the meeting. And more in general, we had the legal framework of the European Union, the level playing field, all the legal protections we have of everything we do together. That's all gone. So all the problems we have with our North Sea neighbor, the UK, that cannot be solved via or through Europe anymore. No, we have to do that directly. So our customs, the leadership of our customs never had to talk directly on trade between the UK and the Netherlands. Suddenly we have a 4-weekly meeting between the heads of our customs organization to make sure that the IT systems can talk to each other. It's amazing. They couldn't because they were all focused toward the outside of the European Union. But UK has now become a third country, it's outside of the European Union, so customs has to work together. In our embassy, we have 3 people from the Netherlands police who on a constant basis, because the UK has left all the information systems when it comes to criminal cooperation in the EU, who suddenly have to really almost physically bring USB sticks to their counterparts in various cities here in the UK to make sure that criminals for whom Brexit is irrelevant because they do their crimes everywhere, they cannot hide from the crimes they committed in the Netherlands by being in the UK and vice versa. So a third element is, for instance, cooperation between universities and the exchange of students that has all been cut off. Almost all. The Horizon program still has some UK elements in it, but in general, also scientific cooperation is under enormous pressure. As an example, you work with Dutch scientists who are bringing live stem cells for research, and then they couldn't bring them into the UK because of customs controls, and all the stem cells were dead within 2 days, and they couldn't do the research. So as an embassy, we try to help all these people, the civil servants. We try to help companies in softening the impact of Brussels. Very especially, and you see here the pictures we've given is when it came to Brexit. As a government, we did something I'm really proud of, and we really had thousands of Dutch companies we could help. We set up a Brexit impact scan and a Brexit portal. The Brexit impact scan was a very nice IT instrument in which you filled in what your company was, what kind of business you were doing, what kind of legal requirements you had, whether you had personnel working here, issues like intellectual property right, whether you had to go through customs. And in the impact scan, it gave immediately among 20 to 30 elements what Brexit would have as impact for your company. And that has been, you see the Brexit monster, which my minister at the time launched. Brexit was something which comes on your desk, which makes it so that you cannot do your job. Or it's the monster which was preventing your truck with your container from crossing the border. With the Brexit impact scan, with the Brexit portal, we've been able to help thousands of Dutch companies. In general, as an embassy, we try not only to inform companies and help implementing them, we're also trying to signal issues towards Brussels where we see concrete issues which have not been addressed or solved in the negotiations between the European Union and the UK. So we try to give input to Brussels, to the Partnership Council, which has been established. And then, of course, we also identify gaps. When the agreement had been concluded the end of last year, quite soon it turned out that in the Brexit agreement, the trade and cooperation agreement, there was no provision on the recognition of driving licenses. And it meant that any Dutch citizen here in the UK who was driving around with a Dutch license did so illegally. The reverse was also true. So quite soon, when we had signaled that, we signaled to our ministers in The Hague, and we got permission to negotiate a bilateral agreement because not an EU competency. And within a couple of weeks in January, we had mutual recognition of passports. And I saw my French colleague a couple of months later, and she had picked up on that. But for them, I think only in May they got that mutual recognition. And so as an embassy, we also have like early warning function. And of course, we are investing in a bilateral relationship. You'll believe that, like earlier this week, if you follow me on Twitter, K van Oostrom, you'll see that I opened a huge Frans Hals exhibition here in the Wallace Collection here in London. And next week, we'll be opening up an exhibition of Dutch maritime art in Scheepvaartmuseum, especially art from the UK. And most of that art is about the Dutch-British wars of 3-4 centuries ago by Van der Velde. So we also invest in the bilateral relationship. Let's go to the next slide, please. I come back to my central point. The private sector, the diplomacy and the EU are closely connected in everything we do. We have a common agenda, we are mutually reinforcing, we're crucial partners, and we need each other. I'm quite sure the private sector needs us diplomats to make sure that there's a stable international environment at the most abstract level, but it is very concrete when it comes to sanctions, and it's very concrete when the German embassy in London helps German companies settle with the problems of Brexit. But the other way around, with the political ambitions of all the agreements we've concluded, both at the global but also at the EU level, we also need the private sector. I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at the amount of investment needed to realize it, and we have summarized it on the Agenda 2030, the private sector has a key role to play. Really, the private sector has a key role to play. As I mentioned, it's a profitable exercise to align yourself with the Sustainable Development Goals in view of the enormous investment which is going to take place in the SDGs. But when I'm talking to my son 4 years ago, when he was looking for a new job, I realized, and we see that in more Dutch companies, it's also something for your personnel policy is crucial. The new generation doesn't want to work for polluting companies. They look also for meaning in their work. And just working for profit is not something which excites the new generation, and certainly not the high potentials of the next generation, which your companies want to have work for you. So having also, apart from the corporate profitability and make sure that the company exists, any company, certainly I would say in the Dutch and also in the German view, a company also has a responsibility towards society, and aligning yourself with the Sustainable Development Goals and contributing to Agenda 2030 is not only doing no harm, it's also the right thing to do, doing the right thing. And secondly, I mentioned the climate agenda here in the UK. In November, we'll have the next climate conference. It was originally foreseen to take place last year, but because of COVID, that couldn't go on. I hope German companies are doing the same, but I would be interested to hear that from you. With Dutch companies, we're contributing with a statement of intent, but also a statement of commitment. The major Dutch companies, both in the UK, but certainly in the Netherlands, so Dutch companies here in the UK, We're working on a document of what these companies want to contribute to the success of that conference. What I just said about Agenda 2030 is also true for climate and climate change and countering climate change. Mm-hmm. The corporate sector has to do what it can to make sure that climate change is stopped, maybe is the best way to say it. And of course, the third one is trade and investment promotion. Work with the German embassy here. You've got a very active embassy, and all the other European embassies as well, is to promote the private sector. And coming to grips with Brexit and all the challenges you see is something we good to do, doing together. On the one hand, together we're shaping the agenda. On the other, we are implementing that agenda. And I think our common ambition is to ensure the prosperity and the health of our peoples. And I think that's a worthwhile common ambition. Maybe to the last slide, please. I'm looking at the time. Yeah, then I'm going to finish. This is all part of something I wrote a lot about in my book. I mentioned I was in the Security Council in 2018 with an orange tie. I always wear an orange tie. The private sector company always has a logo. I have my orange tie to make sure when you talk to 192 colleagues in New York from one country in the world. And by the way, I'm one of the few people in the world who can say I know someone from every country in the world. I wrote a book about that year, which is called With an Orange Tie. It's available on Amazon. And it promotes a lot of the ideas I just mentioned. How do you organize it? How do you manage it? What is the interaction between the EU, diplomacy, and the private sector? And how can we mutually reinforce each other? In my final statement, maybe one wish, I hope. In the Netherlands, we are looking forward to the new German election. I would like to end with paying tribute to the legacy of Angela Merkel. She has been a close friend of my prime ministers. We've worked immensely close with your government in the past years. We admire what Angela Merkel has done for Germany, but certainly what she has done for Europe. And in the Netherlands, we all look with anticipation to the new Bundeskanzler, and we assure, but we also hope that he or she will be in the footsteps of one of the greatest statesmen we've ever seen working in the European Union. James, thank you. Maybe you can end the slideshow, and then we're open for questions. And thank you so much for your attention.
Indeed, thank you very much for your presentation and your lecture, Carl. And we will certainly open the floor to any questions. I have one maybe to start the ball rolling. I see Louise has her hand raised as well. We'll get to Louise next. My question is in relation to Brexit. I have several questions, but I'll keep to one for now. You talk about the private sector and the public sector working hand in hand, or at least the diplomacy sector working hand in hand to solve problems, and you gave a concrete example. But if you roll back to after the Brexit vote, so the people of Britain decided that they needed to leave to leave the European Union, and then the implementation of that decision became very much a hard Brexit, a so-called hard Brexit, where they basically exited the single market, but not only that, though, the common customs, which led to the problems such as the one you described. What happened there in the discussion between the policymakers on the one hand and business on the other? I mean, was there a failure in the communications between the two, or was it something more fundamental?
Yes, an excellent question, James. I think there are two levels there. The position of the European Union, and Michel Barnier, when he negotiated for us, and I have his book, My Secret Diary in French here in my room. If you read his book, it's very clear that from Europe, our ambition was clear to keep the relation as intensive as possible, preferably part of the internal market, if not, then part of the customs union. We gave them EFTA, and Michel always had a graph with him of the 5 models. And the lowest of those was WTO. But we wanted, and I'm quite sure Michel engaged with everyone. I still remember it was clear he had also talked to the private sector. That was our ambition. I think the key role of the other side here in the UK was, this was a political process. It was not an economic process. The government had promised, and certainly after the last election with Boris Johnson, had promised to do a real Brexit, but also a real Brexit. And many of the practical problems we now see are a result of that. And when we talk to the private sector here in the UK, we so often hear that they regret the decision. For instance, we had a session with the city, where, let's say, the financial sector here in London, which is still huge, but which is losing a lot of market share to Frankfurt, to Dublin, to Amsterdam. They complain about the fact that their access to the European market is less than it was. And then we explain, and they never like me when I say it, Brexit is Brexit. The moment that the government here has decided to have a hard Brexit, it means that your access has lowered. The second thing, and that's not in the beginning, but more the second phase, what strikes me here in the UK, in the Netherlands, and I'm quite sure Germany as well, we prepared enormously for the impact of Brexit. So our customs officers in Rotterdam, I think in total, we have more than 900 extra people for all the extra controls, phytosanitary, sanitary, but also documents and the works to make sure that trade can continue, which is also a key issue for Germany, because most of, as I said, most of your trade goes through Rotterdam when it goes to the UK. And on our side, we had some hiccups in the beginning, but in general, that goes very smoothly. Here at the UK side, the lack of preparation is striking. On this side, there's no controls yet. It's beginning step by step, but they're postponing everything. We call this, in our lingo, the border operating model. The amount of customs officers, veterinary officers, both plant-based and non-plant-based phytosanitary inspectors. They don't have enough people yet to do it, and it means that the controls and the checks at this side of the border are not in place yet. And that's amazing. I think it's a lack of preparation on the UK side. And when my Prime Minister spoke to Boris Johnson on Friday night, we were at Downing Street, and this was one of the key issues on the agenda. How can we make sure that the trade between the European Union, but certainly between the Netherlands, Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the UK can continue to flourish? If we talk to private sector more in general and business, they have lost a lot of market share. If you look at exporting companies of the UK, trade has come down. It has really taken a hit. But also the amount of investment we see both in Germany, in Ireland, but certainly also in the Netherlands for distribution centers has gone up. Why? And has led also to moving of jobs from the UK to European Union. Because I'll try to give an example. If there's a British company which produces a container for the European market, it's one set of documents. I mentioned it's about 140 euros cost. But if you have in that container 10 separate clients, it means 10 separate sets of documents. So it's impossible to do that. So what they now do is they set up distribution offices on the main, on the continent. And from that distribution office, they start distributing. It's really an impediment for trade, and it's a deliberate political choice of the UK government, which we couldn't change. What we just can do is help European companies and to help. Oof. Somebody took the motor.
In the house. It is a terrible mess. You mentioned about the postponement of some of the measures on Brexit. I agree in principle that it's probably not an ideal way to deal with it, but it has something to be said for it in the case of Northern Ireland and the protocol there. The kind of unrolling kind of postponement of the full implementation of controls is probably not a bad thing, because it allows certainly the general population, because I think businesses get the advantages they have in the north of Ireland, where they have access to both the EU single market and the British market. But the general population hasn't fully realised that yet. So one is hopeful. But of course, the fact that Britain in general now is suffering from shortages, and those shortages are being felt in Northern Ireland supermarkets as well. I wonder how that's going to come into play. And I also wonder how much the general population in the UK feels that the shortages and the disadvantages that they're feeling in their daily lives are somewhat, I would say, hidden by the by the pandemic rather than Brexit, and so the reality hasn't bitten yet. But let's not get drawn too much into Brexit. Let's try to keep the conversation going. Louise, do you want to ask your question there, or shall I paraphrase it for you? I think you're in a noisy location. Louise asked, and anyone else who'd like to ask a question, just put up your hand like this if you're on video, or just use the raise your hand function. Louise asks, how do you see the role of young innovators, startups and scale-ups in public-private cooperation? What can diplomats do for them?
That's an excellent question. I'll make it quite simple. As an embassy, I mentioned we're doubling in size. We go from 40 to 80 people because all ministries in The Hague are trying to reconnect our cooperation fabric with the UK. And after Germany, UK is basically our biggest partner. And scale-ups and investment and fintech especially are key elements of one of our colleagues in our embassy. And traditional work of diplomats is to, how do you call it, matchmaking, brokering, finding the right counterparts. And so I've got one colleague who really on a day-to-day business is connecting Dutch scale-ups, startups with British capital. It still goes on also after Brexit because the capital markets is here much more entrepreneur-friendly than markets in Europe. I think we have work to do there, but for the moment that market is still there. So we're trying to connect them to capital, that's step one. Secondly, we're trying to connect them to potential cooperation partners who are in the same line of activity. And thirdly, when they're scaling up, we're also trying to help them with accessing the market, finding customers. And it's amazing to see how I never realized that London still is it's not Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of both capital and a lot of innovation with which you connect. And innovation more in general is also a key thing between certainly the Netherlands, and when I talk to my German colleague and other colleagues, it's the same for everyone, but for us, because we're so close to the UK, for us it's extra pertinent. There's about 1,500 Dutch scientists working in the United Kingdom, 1,500, and about 400 in the Netherlands. It's all under pressure. They also have the issue with settled status. What we're trying to do is to still continue to help them, because if you have scientific work, very often, I don't know how it's in Germany, but here in the Netherlands and here in the UK, it is the case. Around universities, you get this whole incubator where young scientists who have a brilliant idea try to bring it to market. So a lot of the startups come from that environment around universities, and that's what we try to promote. And what's very nice in that context is we have set up this Dutch academic network in the UK, and we have almost every month a virtual meeting where people talk about things I hardly understand: photonics, artificial intelligence, news of the newest technologies where ahead of the curve, Dutch-British cooperation makes a difference. And no doubt we do the same with Germany, but that's not my line of work. So that's how we try to help and stimulate, on the one hand, innovation, startups, but also sustainable prosperity for our country.
Excellent. Does anybody from the floor have any questions? I have another question if nobody wants to step in. It's very much a granular one. In the world of diplomacy, you've got many, many talented people, multilingual, lots of experience in different sectors and everything. Is there any difficulty in retaining that talent, or do you have any advice for anyone who, and this is sort of asking for a friend, anybody who's working in the diplomatic sphere who plans to move to the private sector, how best to go about that?
Let me begin with sharing a personal story. When I lived in Damascus between 92 and 96, the companies really needed the embassy because that market, the Syrian government was so all over the economy that, there are markets where the embassy is less crucial, but you couldn't do business if you weren't connected to the embassy. So I worked a lot with Dutch companies, and one of the major food companies who's producing baby food. They approached me and offered me a very nice job as their export manager for all of the Middle East, and they would have doubled my salary. That evening I came home and I talked to my wife. I said, "What do you feel about it?" And we talked a little bit, and our end conclusion was, what do I want to do the rest of my life? Do I want to sell baby food, or want to do my utmost in? I'm going to sound a little bit ambitious, but do I want to contribute to the world being a bit of a better place? So my first advice was, if you have been able to become a diplomat, stick to that job, because it's amazing what we do. Every 4 years you do something different, and it's enormously inspiring. If you want to go to the private sector, I never realized it. A number of my colleagues have done so. I never realized that the skills we have achieved as diplomats, linguistically, but also working with other cultures, our intercultural sensitivity, our ability to modulate our behavior, the way we are able to influence other people by communicating, listening, seeing, by bridging differences, by even having our connections all over the world, is a tremendous advantage for the private sector, where very often people come from specifically the core activity for the business involved. In the international environment is something new. So I see some of my colleagues are working in the building sector, major construction companies, also have moved to companies like Heineken, like Shell. So it happens. It's not something I will ever do. It's not where my passion is. My passion really is about the issues I talked about. Working with citizens, working with companies, working with governments, and trying to come to agreements and making this world a little bit more peaceful, a little bit more prosperous, a little bit more sustainable. I'm passionate about that.
I guess the general population don't really realize the behind the scenes work that goes to kind of keep everything moving along. I know that in Ireland, when I go back to my hometown, people ask me if I'm still in Europe. They regard the fact that I live and work in Brussels, that I'm in Europe, and they have no idea that I have nothing to do with the European institutions. Albeit now with United Europe, I'm somewhat sort of on the fringes, but prior to that, I was in the private sector. It's amazing to see the sort of distance in the minds of regular people in their daily lives. They don't realize how much of this goes on to kind of keep the system working. Does anyone in the audience? I see we have one hand raised here. From Hans van den Berg. You want to ask a question? Go ahead, Hans.
Introduce yourself, Hans, first.
I'm Hans van den Berg. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm sitting here in lovely The Hague, actually quite close to where the former Foreign Office was here, which is now our parliamentary chambers for the time being. And I have a question, Karel, because I'm quite curious for your time that you've now spent in London. One of the major discussions about how Brexit came about is this gap between Brussels and the rest of Europe, especially the capitals and the people who actually live within the European Union. That is one of the causes that people in London, in the UK, felt so disconnected from Brussels and from what was happening there, that was one of the causes that caused Brexit. Now, I'm wondering, is there anything that you have learned from that we can take along in the work that we do either in the public or in the private sector, that we can show a little bit more or connect more with Brussels, or to work on closing that gap?
Yeah, I think it's both a technical and a political question. On the technical side, a lot of work we do in Brussels is technical. So it's about really making political compromise on so many issues. And any decision which comes from Brussels, as we say, it comes from Brussels. It's nonsensical to say it comes from Brussels, because it comes from our own capital, which has gone to Brussels, has made a political compromise, and has led to some kind of regulation to make sure that we have a common regulation all of the European Union. My favorite example, of course, is that one of the big problems here in the UK, when people are saying this was horrible, very often here in the UK, it's what we call gold plating of European decisions. By adding an extra layer of making decisions more effective. So on the one hand, it's technical. It's hard to explain the work which has been done. So make it more, to communicate better about it is the one thing. The other, I think, is quite political, certainly here in the UK, but I think in more countries in European Union, we see too often that politicians say, well, I didn't want it, but Brussels wants it. We have to do it because of Brussels. It's not legitimizing the decision-making process, which in essence, of course, is extremely democratic. The decisions which are being made by Brussels are not a separate empire which tells us what to do. No, what's being decided by the Commission, we have input in there. We have our own man in there. What's being decided amongst the member states in all the things we decide in Brussels is something we have put input in. My colleague diplomats have been there based on instructions of their political masters. And in the end, our political masters have signed off on all Brussels decisions. So it's, I mentioned it's technical to explain the technical in comprehensible terms. It's political. And in the political, it's enormously, it's communication so often. But it pays off. It pays off to pay politically, certainly in the UK, but also for some parties in the Dutch spectrum, to say that Brussels is no good and we want to be autonomous, we want to be sovereign. I'm convinced that in Dutch we have an expression, the ship will hit the shore. There will be a moment also here in the UK that if you look at the challenges because of Brexit, and you mentioned the empty shelves, James, if you look at the problems with trade, it'll have really income consequences for the people. And that will be the moment that I would say the course of the country will move a little bit again. For the Netherlands, I'm happy about the government, which has consistently tried to make the case that Europe is something which is of the interest of every citizen.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Please, yeah.
Because this also touches a little bit on, well, you're a diplomat, you have some experience in the private sector. United Europe is also on that sort of meeting point of public and private. As a diplomat, you have to accept that generally when you're working on something, especially in the beginning, it's one step forward, 5 steps backwards, then a step to the side, then a step to another side. And if you're in the private sector, you very much like to have a goal, have a deadline, work towards it, make steps forward, and preferably not go anywhere backward. How do you bring these two worlds in that together? Because that can be very, very hard to get sort of the private sector in line with how sometimes public and definitely diplomacy works.
Well, first and foremost, let me say that I'm very happy we have someone from the Netherlands in our evening tonight, because United Europe, when I talked to James about this evening, I already connected you, James, to VNO-NCW in the Netherlands to see whether we could have more connections between Dutch institutions and United Europe, because you're in essence German, but you have a pan-European ambition, if I may say that. So first and foremost, let's see whether, James, you can get a connection to Mr. van den Berg. I think that would be useful. The practical answer, Hans, for me is very simple. My colleagues, they're fed up with my saying step by step, shwai shwai in Arabic. Step by step. Do what is realizable, what's realistic. Count your blessings in what you can achieve. And when I was in the council, for me, I'd really worked in Syria. I tried to promote human rights. I did my utmost in the program we had in living in Damascus. And we made a lot of headway, I felt at the time. So for me, being in the Security Council, 7 years after the breakout of the civil war, 7 years after more than 500,000 people had been killed, 7 years after more than 11 million people had lost their homes, in 7 years in which a beautiful country had been destroyed because of the regime, I was extremely disappointed. I didn't like when you said 1 step forward, 5 steps backwards. In this one, it was 1 step forward and 1,000 steps backwards, or maybe even 500,000 steps backwards. But we have to grow with what we can achieve. With the private sector, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I mentioned about the Ruggie principles. I talked about UN, the Sustainable Development Goals. Working in New York with the private sector, and certainly in the Global Compact, and I presume, James, with United Europe, you also have connection with that wonderful sub-UN organization which connects the end to the private sector. I was always inspired when talking to private sector, which coming to New York and connecting with Guterres and his team, always made clear that doing the right thing is not something which is akin to the private sector. Paul Polman of Unilever used to say, businessmen also have a conscience. And Paul Polman was also quite aware that when he was talking about sanitation and about the need for more healthy circumstances and better water, that it would also mean he would be able to sell more soap. So it's hand in glove when it comes to that.
Yeah, we're not connected with that association yet, or that organization. We are very, very small in our secretariat. We only have 2 full-time people, but I will look into that. And we do have some members who advocate exactly what you're talking about, private business doing things better for the world because it makes sense for business. One of whom spoke yesterday on our event on migration and security policy, Martin Schuller, who brought out a book called Africa First, and his main thesis is we got to go to Africa not to help but to invest because it will build the infrastructure and make lives better and wages and so on better for the people of Africa. It means a better market then for our products, and it also then reduces problems of overpopulation and stabilization of democracy and everything. I think we're going to have to leave it there. However, we are at the end of our time. Hans van den Berg and to anyone else, please do drop me a line if you want to stay in touch, and we'll keep you informed of our future events. If you'd like to support our work, you can do that by joining us at www.united-europe.eu. If you're following this on, if you see this as a recording on YouTube, please do click on like and subscribe, as the influencers say. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time, and we'll see you soon at our next event, which will hopefully be in person, if not in person and hybrid. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Be safe.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.